coordinator of the Non-Traditional Livelihood Network, or the NTL network, which is a member-based group of 36 organizations and individuals, and we are across 11 states. I will be moderating this panel. We want to thank our co-hosts, Institute of Social Studies Trust, for this collaboration.
The next financial year,
Good.
Yeah, just 1 second.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The Non-Traditional Livelihoods Network is a network that has been recently founded, and co-founded by Azad and a host of other organizations. Azad Foundation holds the secretariat, and I am also the research director and advocacy director from Azad Foundation, as well as the Non-Traditional Livelihoods coordinator. The fact that we are meeting here virtually and missing out on the physical interactions is a grim reminder of the context we are all in globally. The context that has impacted us all, COVID. It may be a pandemic, but it has not just impacted our health. It has deepened our fragmentations. It has widened the gaps in society in terms of access to resources, education, skills, work, and women have been at the receiving end of it. Loss of jobs with low hope of recovery because of higher rates of unpaid care work. In situations where the female labor force participation rate was already low. Increasing gender-based violence, which has also been named as a shadow pandemic, or cases of early marriage, or disparate educational access because of the digital gender gap. These are some of the dismal tidings that are there around us. However, amidst these dismal tidings, there are rays of hope. Today's discussion will focus on these initiatives that are expanding work choices for women, non-traditional livelihoods, trades which were considered masculine at one time and still, to a certain extent, carry a no entry sign for women. Today, as a network and with collaboration with ISST, we are hosting this panel where we are going to discuss some findings, some initiatives from the Non-Traditional Livelihood Network, and discuss how it can be a pathway to a gender-just recovery from COVID. When we decided that how do we define non-traditional livelihoods, could you please put the non-traditional livelihoods definition up, Monica? Thank you. Thank you. When, as a network, we wanted to define the non-traditional livelihoods, we realized that it is not just about some professions, but it is about disruptions. Non-traditional livelihoods, therefore, have been defined as livelihood practices that help women break stereotypes and challenge the gender division of labor emerging from intersections of gender, caste, class, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and other marginalities and oppressive structures within a dynamic context of space and time. NTL increases the set of viable livelihood choices, making available to women and giving them access and control over skills, technology, market, mobility, and resources. It creates economic stability along with psychosocial, social, psychological, social, and political empowerment. The Generation Equality Forum actually has committed some $40 billion for bringing about a gender equality. And today's discussion somewhere will help us set pathways to how the gender just or gender equality can be achieved. How can we expand the narrative of women, work, and empowerment? So going forward, let me extend a warm welcome to our distinguished panel of women leaders who are going to be joining me today for this discussion over the next 120 minutes or 2 hours. These leaders are from different fields of research, international development, funding organizations, national implementing organizations. I welcome Sukti Dasgupta, Chief Employment, Labor Markets and Youth Branch from ILO, who's joining us from Geneva. Welcome, Sukti. Next, Ms. Karuna, Dr. Karuna Onta. Karuna Onta says she wants to be referred to as Karuna Onta, PhD. I'm sorry. Social Development Advisor, Governance, Politics and Services Team, British Embassy, who's joining us from Nepal. Anvesha Ghosh, Research Fellow and from our co-host, Institute of Social Studies Trust. Welcome, Anvesha. Nikita Bengani, who's the head youth development from Quest Alliance, who's also a network member. Welcome, Nikita. And lastly, our member, Cecilia Soriano, who's the Regional Policy and Advocacy Coordinator from ASPE, who could not join us due to a sudden family health emergency today. We will miss you, but we know, and COVID has taught us the fragility of everyday lives, and valuing our family is crucial. So hope your family will get better soon. On this note, let me start with the panel. So let me start with you, Sukti. Could you share with us a little bit about the landscape of women's access to decent work, and what are the new spaces the changing nature of work is creating for women's inclusion?
Thank you, Amrita, and thanks very much for inviting me as well. It's my great pleasure and privilege to be with all of you today, and greetings from the ILO in Geneva. I have a presentation. Is Monica going to put it up, or? Okay, so so thanks a lot. And just to go straight into slide 2. So what I will do in the few minutes that I have, Amrita, is outline basically, the labor market situation of women before the COVID crisis happened, and then what has been the impact of the crisis. And finally, I will end with, some key issues that would be relevant for the discussion that we are having today. So first and foremost, despite certain gains that were made in the last, I would say, 20 years, there have been significant decent work gaps between women and men, both in terms of the quantity of jobs available as well as the quality of jobs just before COVID happened. And I will just mention a couple of key statistics. The labor force participation gap between women and men has remained around 26 percentage points globally. But if you look at the South Asia region, it's been about 50 percentage points in the gap between women and men, and it has been rising. So it's indeed something to bear in mind. On top of that, as you all know, when women do enter the labor force, there is a lot of occupational segregation, which is why the discussion around non-traditional livelihoods is so important. And women, as if you see in the graph here, on the left side, we have the distribution of occupations between women and men in the world, and then in South Asia. And in South Asia, you still have a lot of women working in agriculture and in the low-end services. And we also know that they tend to be less skilled and more likely to be in the informal economy. In fact, 90.7% of women working are in the informal economy as compared to slightly lower percentage for men. But what is also very interesting and very, I would say a concern is the fact that a lot of women who are working today, who are counted as workers, are what we call unpaid or contributing family workers, in the sense that they work towards a family enterprise, but they don't really get a salary or a pay. So, they have no control over either their work or the pay from it. The next slide, please. And actually, one of the reasons why we have, especially in the South Asian region, still a real big gap in terms of labor force participation is the care work. Amrita, you mentioned it, but here I wanted to put forward some statistics in terms of the time spent in care work between women and men in the world, in South Asia, and here we have data for India, so I wanted to also put that up. And if you see, of course, women are spending more time in unpaid care work than in paid work, but the situation in India is particularly concerning. Here you have the difference between men and women very stark. Women spending 4 hours, 57 minutes on care work on the average daily, whereas for men it is 31 minutes, that is half an hour. And of course, that is because of social norms, cultural situation, but also because of lack of access to skills that women have, the few opportunities for employment. And we find that, there is a statistical concept called needs, which is used in the context of the Sustainable Development Framework. And one of the SDG goals is to reduce the need rate globally. But in the context of South Asia, 47% of young women, and here I mean young women between the ages of 15 and 29 are in the NEET category. So a lot of young girls, they actually finish their schooling and then they move into an inactivity status because of a number of reasons. We'll come into that. But also when they do enter the labor force or when they do want a job, we find that the time that a young woman takes to enter the labor market after finishing education is much longer than that which a young man takes. So there are all these gender-based gaps in decent work. And yet I also wanted to say that while we are talking about non-traditional work, in Asia, and here they're talking about East Asia, Southeast Asia, as well as South Asia, the structural transformation and the growth that has happened has been based on women's work in the labor-intensive sectors. For example, the garment sector, and you have the figure from Bangladesh, where you can see that share of women's employment in the garment sector has gone up, along with growth in the country. But the reason why I put this up is that there is a concern here too, because we find that when in this traditionally women-dominated sectors, when the productivity rises and wages rise, women are crowded out. And we have data from China where we did some recent research where it's very clearly, you can see this trend very clearly. And obviously that raises implications about digitalization and automation that is happening a lot in the industry sector and what would happen to women's jobs. And it's all the more important, therefore, to create alternative opportunities for women, particularly in the non-traditional sector. And next slide, please. And in this context, I also wanted to say that there is change happening. It's not that it's not happening. And when we look at young women, particularly here the data is from the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We found that younger women are moving into traditionally so-called male jobs in the high-skill sectors, whether it is in the construction engineering sector, whether it is in terms of high-end communication, human health, or the business sector, or even finance. And yet, overall, when you look at the picture for men and women, and especially in terms of women's entry into, let's say, the modern services sector, we find that women tend to occupy the entry-level positions rather than the middle or the higher. So there's a lot more that needs to be done. So it is really in this kind of a situation where there were existing, quite significant gaps that the COVID crisis happened. Next slide, please. And as Amrita, you already pointed out, many of the gains that were made, we find in our research, are being pushed back. And gender equality has taken a huge hit in the context of the crisis. And you can see from this figure very clearly in 2020, the ILO analysis shows that women lost out on jobs and income earning opportunities much faster, much bigger rate than men did. But also, instead of moving into unemployment, what was happening is that they were being pushed out of the labor market altogether. So moving into a status that is called inactivity. Next slide, please. And amongst women, again, the biggest hit has been the young women. So young women in countries like India, in the middle income countries have been really, really badly hit. And that's because of a number of reasons. First and foremost, the sectoral segmentation that I spoke about, they are overrepresented in those sectors such as food services, accommodation, retail, domestic work, labor-intensive manufacturing, which were the first to get hit. Secondly, they don't have the social protection. They are normally in the informal economy. Then there was a risk of contagion. A lot of women work in the front line, the Anganwadi workers, for example, in India, essential workers. And so the choice was often between, going to work or getting the infection. And then, of course, during the teleworking period, the unpaid care work share was disproportionate for women. So, and also the gender-based divide was very huge. It became, accentuated during this crisis. And as a result, many women opted out of the labor force. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight a few key issues for the conversation today, because, the question is that there will be crisis. We are faced with a crisis today. Maybe there's a crisis around the corner, but the question is how the labor market is prepared so that, women are able to work with dignity, with security, with safety, or basically that there is decent work for women. And some of the learnings from this crisis as well as past crisis is that gender is used as a rationing mechanism when jobs are scarce. So they are driven out of the labor market when there are fewer jobs in the labor market. So first and foremost, the total, the pie of work needs to increase. But work from home, as I already said, was also very difficult. On the one hand, it allows flexibility to women and therefore is welcomed. But on the other hand, the unpaid care burden with the paid work became too much for many women, and it led to many kinds of problems, as you all know. The digital divides, as I already mentioned, but also the gender-based violence. ILO has documented a lot of it. In fact, it's also important in the context of the recent convention that all member states adopted in terms of prevention of violence against women. But also that fiscal consolidation, where there's a lot of talk around fiscal consolidation now that we see some recovery from the crisis, has particularly negative impact for women workers, not only as, in terms of the labor force participation, but also as beneficiaries of public services. And finally, in the context of recovery from the COVID crisis, how does one build back better, but also build back fairer? And there we are looking at, tracking a few sectors. Care includes education and health, the green, that is sustainable, environmentally sustainable sectors, and the digital, which are growing and which are likely to grow in the future. But the question, therefore, is how do you make investments in jobs and skills for women so that they can access the non-traditional jobs within these sectors? And I will end by saying that, what is really needed is gender responsive policies, but also a coordinated approach. Skills are very important. Transition policies, my middle pillar, are absolutely key. So social protection, access to the skills, redistribution of care. But the other two arms, the job creation as well as the rights, need to go hand in hand, because if there are no jobs, even after getting the skills, the women will be either discouraged or they will remain unemployed. And underlying all of this is the agency, the collective voice, and the representation, which also women lack so often. But there is enough research to show that when there is organization, when there is collective voice representation, women have a much better deal in the labor market. So let me stop here, Amrita, and back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sukti. Thank you for highlighting the dismal tidings as well as the opportunities. Yes, we do understand that, the NEET rates are very high, and NEET would be not in education, employment, or training. And for young girls, it is, if you say 47%, that's really high. Difficult for young girls to enter sectors. But yes, when you talked about collectivization, collective voice, the idea that, we need to expand the viable opportunities for women, and NTL has the opportunity to do that. And also a rights-based framework along with collective voices and agency. Thank you. Over to you, Karuna, now. You have decades of work with funding organizations. And what do you think donors are doing? How are they contributing to create spaces for inclusion of women in skills to work? And what are the challenges and learnings from your work in Nepal? Karuna?
Thank you, Amrita, for your question. I would like to thank you all.
Monica, I'm really sorry. Could you please switch off the, could you please put off the presentation? Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Karuna.
Thank you, Amrita. And I would like to thank you all for inviting me as a panelist at this session. And I work for the British Embassy Kathmandu office, and this is an organization which was earlier known as DFID, Department for International Development. After the global merger, the foreign country office and DFID were converted into one organization, and our name globally became Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. And in Nepal, we introduce ourselves as British Embassy Kathmandu office staff. So I will speak what the UK government is doing in Nepal to make sure that we contribute in attaining gender equality, reducing the gender inequality gaps. So what we are doing in Nepal is, for UK globally, women and girls has become a priority, and it has always been a priority. In Nepal also, the Constitution of Nepal, for example, is very progressive, particularly the 2015 Constitution. What it says in its various articles that gender-based discrimination will not happen against women, whether it be related to remuneration for equal or same work, or whether it be related to sexual and reproductive health rights. It also commits to protect women from any forms of physical, mental, sexual, or psychological gender-based violence. It also talks about rights to access and participate in all state structures. And it also ensures that women have access to health, education, employment, and social security on the basis of positive discrimination, and equal rights in property and family affairs. So the context that the Constitution of Nepal sets out provides space for any donor to do more and to contribute more on reducing the gender inequality gaps. What specifically UK government has globally prioritized is to work in 5 broad areas. And these include girls' education, women's economic empowerment, women's political participation, sexual and reproductive health rights, violence against women and girls. So around these 5 broad thematic areas, the UK government supports the Nepal government to fulfill the commitment that it has made in its constitution. So we are funding a number of programs through the British Embassy Kathmandu office, and also through our centrally funded, globally funded projects to work on ensuring that we contribute significantly in these 5 priority areas that we work in. What we are also forced to do is there is the International Development Gender Equality Act of 2014, which asks all the partner organizations that are implementing any project with deficit funding to be compliant in accordance to that act. And what it means is any FCDO funding that are going, any FCDO funding that is supporting a intervention has to demonstrate that it reduces gender inequality gaps. And programs have to be accountable to be compliant towards this Gender Equality Act. And what it has done is it has created an opportunity for partners to do more and to be true to what the Act asks for. Because if you sign an agreement with FCDO, you have to fulfill that mandate, because this is a legal requirement that we have to follow. Now, if you look at, the challenges to work in Nepal has been, particularly in the context of non-traditional work, is, the economic status of women in Nepal is far from what we would have want to see. The labor force, if you look at the working age force of Nepali women, it is much more than men. 11.3 million women are constitute of labor force, whereas for men, it's only 9.5 million. Despite the huge number of workforce of women, only 22.5% are employed. So which means the employment, as Suti was earlier saying, first of all, there's lack of jobs, not only for women, but for men as well. But for women, it's even worse because of the gender stereotypes, because of the social norms, because of the limitations and restrictions that are imposed to them societally. uh, to be inside the house periphery restricts them from trying out and wanting to do things that they would very eagerly want to do. And the households, that only 19.7% households have land and house in women's name. And that is also, the government has provided some subsidy if a property is bought in the name of the women. Also, if a company is registered in the name of the women, they get some kind of subsidy tax redemption. So it may be that 19.7% households own a land or house are owned in women's name, but it may not necessarily be that the control over that land and resources is held by women. And if even, for example, if you look at the community natural resource management committees at the local level, 40 to 50% members of the community are the members of natural resource committee members are women, 40 to 50%, which is almost equal as men, which is a very progressive sign. But at the same time, this does not mean that they have control over the resources and decision-making power. When I keep saying women, I also want to reiterate that women, as we all know, are not a homogeneous group. There are women from within the women groups, and and Amrita very beautifully mentioned in her opening remarks that there are intersectional, there are multiple dimensions that come into the way which put one woman in a worse situation than the other one, based on her caste, her ethnicity, her geographic location, her educational status, her marital status, and whatnot. There could be a number of dissections that could be followed. So when we talk about NTL, bringing in women into non-traditional livelihood opportunities, we also need to be carefully monitoring and looking at which women, what profession, and what returns they are getting by being a part of those professions. The Ministry of Women and Children, before we went into the federalization, used to run a women's development program, which mobilized rural women into becoming cooperative members. But these cooperative members were extremely effective in bringing women together. But they always did. There were more than 1 million women members of these cooperatives, which invested their collective fund into small businesses. But these committees, cooperatives, were not always able to bring in the Dalits, the ethnic minorities, the religious minorities in the membership, and at the same time in leadership positions. Women's employment, also, if we look at women's employment, as I said earlier, traditionally women's workspace is her home. Even if she's doing her work as a farmer, the farms are owned by her family members. She spends hours and hours, much more hours than men in many cases, but the return of that work is not counted in cash, and also it is not recognized as a human resource contributing to the agriculture development of the country. The National Demographic Health Survey of 2016 reports that 27% of the married women have experienced sexual and gender-based violence, despite them being only inside their home periphery. So home not necessarily is the safest place for women to be here, and particularly during the time of COVID, as earlier mentioned by Sukti, violence increased, gender-based violence inside the home increased, suicide increased, suicide cases also increased in Nepal. So the employment and relationship of violence against women and economic growth is extremely high. So now the next questions you talk about, you talk about the challenges, right? What challenges do we face as a donor organization? The challenges are multiple. A few that I would like to mention here is, we don't we are very dependent on the UK government budget allocations. And we don't know when those budgets are cut down. And in the crisis context, for example, there, we did have budget cuts. And what this is at the time of severe need, we had to work with budget cuts, which seemed very unfair to us, but that's a UK ministerial decision. And as British Embassy staff, there is very little we can do. The second thing is that the second challenge is that, as much as we would like to work with Women's Network, women's-led local organizations, the Women's Federation, our procurement policies are such, procedures are such, that we don't get to work with them directly. It has to come through an international organization or a big firm that could then manage the risks for us. So those are the few limitations. And the third big limitation is that, we are seen as donor, we are seen when we take up very sensitive issues, we are criticized of being, taking the space that the Nepali communities could take. So donors are also seen we have to be very careful. We have to tread very carefully on what issues we support and what issues we don't. So we have to work in that context. I'll stop here for now, Amrita, and if you have any follow-up questions, I'll be happy to take forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karuna. Thank you for reiterating some of the things that we had already heard from Sukti and adding to it. And the fact that, even within a progressive donor space, where like you said, there is an equal work on education, economic empowerment, politics, sexual reproductive health and rights, and violence focus. So, a varied focus from the donor, but there are budgetary cuts that one has to look at. There are other allocations that one has to be mindful of, or also the structural problems that are there. Is the fact that a government has given some subsidy actually leading to ownership of women, of land, actually leading to control? So these are some of the things that even Sukti was also talking about. Women are contributing. You were also saying that women are contributing in the household work, in farm labor, but is that contribution being counted as work? So these are some of the things with which we will go on to our next panelist, Anvesha. And she will be focusing on the learnings from the ongoing study with non-traditional livelihood practitioners. So maybe some answers from her will come forth. And just to encourage people to share their questions, comments in the chat while we are going on. Over to you, Anvesha.
Thank you, Amrita. Thank you so much. To begin with, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon in India. And thank you to the panelists for joining us in this collaboration between ISST and the Non-Traditional Livelihood Network. Very quickly, I would like to introduce Institute of Social Studies Trust. We are almost 42 years old, registered not-for-profit organization. And our core agenda is pursuit of research, capacity building, and community level outreach activities with the aim of influencing policy for gender equitable outcomes. We posit ourselves at the interface of research, action, and policy, providing valuable inputs into grassroots activism and policy debate. Thank you, everyone. I will now start with my presentation. Next slide, please, Monica. So my presentation basically is based on two studies that we have been recently. One has been recently completed just last year, which was on women workers and the gig economy in India. And sort of this particular, the next study, which is the scope of skilling in NTL in achieving WE ongoing. It's an ongoing study with the NTL network. And currently, this study was in a very organic growth because it sort of flew from the earlier study on the women workers in the gig economy. Because wherever we were going, especially we looked at 4 sectors. We looked at cab drivers, beauty workers, domestic workers, and delivery girls, food delivery girls. And both, especially in cab driving as well as in beauty skilling, there was a lot of emphasis on skilling, which were technical as well as soft skills, a lot of emotional labor. So it was a very interesting concept, and that's how we thought we really need to dig deeper in this. And that's when we sort of decided we approach Amrita and got into this particular research with the partners of the NTL network. So the data collection is still on. So I'm just going to present preliminary data from this particular study. Can we start? Go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So these are some of the findings based from our earlier report, which is the women workers in the gig economy. Definitely, because as I said, we looked at cab drivers as well as beauty workers working through a platform. So looking at that comprehensive definition. We looked at this opportunity. So it obviously there was this gave an opportunity to earn more than a very traditional form of training in a brick and mortar place. Women were now on an app able to sort of pick and choose jobs. Again, this comes with a disclaimer that the pick and choose jobs is all based on an algorithmic management. So it's not as flexible as the hype around platform economy is, that it provides flexibility to the worker. We definitely saw that there was a lot of self-confidence, of course, getting the technical skills very clearly, like somebody like in a cab driving profession. Suddenly you were able to drive a car which you were not even able to ever touch before. So there was definitely a self-confidence. There was a personality development, as we'll also see in our next research, that there's a lot of effort that goes into, uh, you know, into making a worker. It's not just like to identify yourself as a worker. There's a lot of effort that goes into it, not just technical skills, but support from the NGO that's training you, providing life skill education, giving you knowledge about the legislation around you, your rights as a worker, etc. There was an ability to negotiate in the market space. There was obviously an aspirational feel to it, as I just mentioned. And there was a lot of technical know-how, because now you suddenly had a smartphone in your hand and you could use it for your work. So this very fact also sort of pushed you, as we see, and so we did mention the digital divide is one of the major reasons why we do not, in fact, see lot many women in the platform economy as well. Mostly categorized again in the beauty work sector, which is again a very traditional form of work. But we now see a lot of women coming in. There's a lot of interest in driving for us. And we in fact saw in this particular research as well that of course, there was a clear-cut platform economy, but a lot of women drivers are actually recruited by companies and startups for ferrying women passengers and school kids. So there are these various models that have turned up, and these are the opportunities for women to actually take up skills in non-traditional livelihoods. What were the challenges? Very clearly, the unreadiness of the market. So yes, I am a skilled worker, but is the market ready for me? Is there a market for me? And that is a very important thing that I think anybody that's going into non-traditional livelihood has to keenly think about. Even before, I think, skilling, when we had this conversation with our partners in a place like as remote as North Bengal, which is just a tea garden, very high chances of girls being trafficked. Is there a market? To create a market is a major consideration, even before skilling girls in certain areas like this. There's a high attrition rate during training. In fact, women prefer short-term trainings, even in the non-traditional places. We see a lot of high attrition rate, mainly because of care reasons, because women cannot follow up an entire 4-month, 5-month to 6-month duration. There are stop gaps as well. In fact, the partners also work in a way that if a woman sort of drops down, can come back at a later stage and begin again. The COVID impact, in fact, was showed a very major reason that a lot of women lost out on skilling during the COVID time. And even those who had been skilled just before the pandemic hit now actually need a refresher course, because they did not have the means to practice any of the skills, be it on the computer, be it a mobile thing, be it carpentry, be it driving a cab. So actually there is now a need to again go back to square one and they are demanding a lot of demanding a refresher course for these particular this couple of years loss of practice that they've done. Clearly, gender norms, as we all know, are a strong demotivation for women to be able to go out there and access any type of skills, and to think about non-traditional skills is just another layer up to it. There's a lot of challenge on and disbelief that a woman can actually do something like this by spouses, by in-laws, and it is absolutely a very clear this that without the support of at least one champion in the family, women cannot step out and do this kind of skilling for sure. And to then bring it on to a level where they'll be placed in a job and continue in that job. So there is definitely a need to work within the family as well. Concerns around safety, I think that is also, how do you work in a male-dominated, traditionally a male-dominated sector? Being harassed by police if you're driving in the car, not really, the male camaraderie on the road, that you always stand away from the male drivers, even if you are a personal driver of somebody, because they don't want to speak to you. They're curious about you, but wouldn't want to speak to you. So you're often a lone worker. In most cases, and especially so in the platform economy, I mean, not just reducing it to women themselves, but on the platform economy, you are a lone worker. You do not have the possibility of interacting with any other workers, and it's more so in case of women, because we also saw that there are a lot of organizations now organizing gig workers, especially in India, and with the pandemic being actually a boost to that organizing, because a lot of platform workers were not essential workers during this time. But we do not really see women organizing until just a few months back, that we saw a lot of these beauty workers who worked on a very major platform in India called Urban Company coming and demanding rights against high commission, safety issues, etc. So they're mostly lone workers. And I think that is also a very important point for you to realize yourself as a worker, and then to have worker rights. So how do you demand? Where do you demand? I think that is something equally important. And of course, lack of supportive infrastructure amenities, especially for care needs. And I think that's where the state and the market are very, very important to provide them. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what happens to skilling? When a woman gets into a skilling in NTL, what does it mean for her? These are definitely a potential to earn more, to dream big. I'll cite an example recently of the North Bengal case again. It's completely a tea garden dominated place. The pandemic hit, the gardens stopped, and there was just no work. And it's a very big major trafficking point. There was a lot of, in fact, a lot of NGOs working around that, work on anti-trafficking for girls and young girls and women. So one of the girls came up with this idea with one of the organization partners called Jobala, to work on something other than beauty work, basically something that can build into a business, an entrepreneurship at some point. And the girls sort of brainstormed, and these were young girls between the age group of 18 to 20 years, and they thought about, why not paint houses? There's always a demand for houses being constructed and being painted. So this was, in fact, a sort of a COVID necessity, COVID-induced necessity that came up. And that's how the non-traditional sort of took off there. And they've just finished, a batch of 10 girls have just finished, and they, of course, have their own struggles with that. So this is definitely a potential to earn more and to dream big. It definitely challenges norms. And interestingly, it sort of triggers an inter and an intra-generational sort of positive norms that have started trickling down. As soon as you see the woman sort of goes out, has started working in a non-traditional form of work, there is a respect in the community, of you not being ever seeing a woman do this particular job, but now there is an aspiration now amongst the other girls, and there is this a slight shift in balance between the husband and the wife, and who's going to take care of the care responsibilities, etc. So these are these very initial preliminary findings that I'm talking about. And of course, personality development. There is much confidence, there is an idea to grow bigger, not stop there. So for example, this one particular woman in Bhubaneswar who actually drives a garbage collection light mechanical vehicle. And there are 3 women who have been trained under the driving, the Sakha and Azad Foundation's driving scholarship with CYSD in Bhubaneswar in Eastern India in a state called Odisha. And there is this aspiration around the women who are working with them and others who are in the community to become like her, like them. And then now she wants to drive a bus. So she's like, this is fine. This is wonderful. It gives me a lot of visibility. Big senior officers come and speak to me. So it's a wonderful thing. But now I want to drive a bus, and that will give me a more steady state government income. So, so that kind of aspirations are coming up. And in fact, she's the one who says this, my in-laws were completely, so she was actually pregnant when she came to her maternal home. And that's when she got to know that this is happening. The skilling for driving a 4-wheeler was advertised around that time. And she signed up, and she had a 3-month-old baby, and she was supposed to go back to her native village, but she stuck on. And her mother left her job as a domestic worker and started working, helping her with the childcare. And in fact, she was a remarkable, from the trainer to the organization. Everybody was like, how is she going to do it? But she just had this fire in her. She needed obviously there were economic needs, but she just did it. And she was so happy, because now when she goes back and she takes gifts with them, and she very specifically said that I take gifts with them, give with me with my own money. So people from the village actually come out to see her, like, this is a woman who drives a car. Women don't even touch a car in her village. So these are the kind of changes that one sees in this kind of thing. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what does it mean? As of course, the skilling and getting work in the NTL sector helps in going beyond economic empowerment to a more holistic and respectable identity building for the woman. I think this was a very important thing, is this identity building. It's a lot of self-worth. A lot of women kept expressing, besides the fact that it was skilling, you always do get skilling chances, but the fact that it sort of is something different than what you would be expected of a woman. And that helps in a lot of self-value, a lot of self-worth. So that identity building is a very crucial part of NTL skilling. The entire skilling ecosystem needs to be based on gender justice premise, as we have seen. The market readiness for women in NTL is essential for a long-term engagement in the NTL sector. It requires a lot of hand-holding, and the skilling process sometimes spills over even when they have found a job. So, there's often a way of falling out of the jobs, especially for young girls, when they again get married or they're about to have children. So that is a concern that we see all across, and it's true for here as well. It's important to understand the ecosystem varies from geographical location and cultural context. And as we said, all women are not homogeneous groups. So they have caste, class, race identities, and it varies from that point of view. So any project, anything, any design has to be, then it's not one size fits all. Then it has to be custom made, and the state also needs to understand that. An example here would be the Bhubaneswar government of Orissa and the Bhubaneswar Municipal Corporation, in fact, has been one of the bright spots, I would say. They've been very encouraging, part of the smart city campaign in India. So there is an SOP that sort of very clearly states that we will hire women as drivers for garbage collection units, but it just ends there. So it's like an open invite to women. But when we spoke to higher authorities, they were very clear, like, oh, anybody who's interested can come in. But they were completely not sure about how are you going to fit women with small children, women of a particular age, disability, etc., etc. So there was no clarity there. So this is just an example of where we really need to work at. There is a domino effect in the communities. As I said, one woman sort of stands up, she's covered by the media, etc. She becomes a star. The other women start uh, getting aspired, and so for example, again, this person who's driving the garbage vehicle, she's helped with two other girls who are actually garbage collectors, and traditionally it's a community of garbage collectors. But now these girls want to become a driver because all the senior authorities come and speak to her and don't speak to us. So that there is that aspiration that's coming uh, from there. But it's again very interesting that while a few of them become stars, what happens to the rest of them? And I think as organizations, I think it's important to not forget that, okay, these 3 were there, but what about the 7 who also attended? And I think that is something that we really need to think about as practitioners. Yes, along with technical skilling, life skilling and soft skills are essential towards better earning opportunities. We just cannot leave them at the technical skilling, which we've seen a lot of these government institutes do. It's a one fit for all. And as we see, and Nikita is going to just speak about how the ITIs are just not very women friendly because of the curriculum, etc. Any disruption can lead to a fallout from the skilling process and the market, like the COVID-19 impact. There is also a need to understand that these are very, while a lot of support is provided by NGOs by giving them an apprenticeship, etc., while they are skilling, but in case something like a government scheme comes out and you're part of the skilling, there is a lot of investment that will go in from their end. There will be resources, and you cannot always be there. We want the state to take this up at some point. So what happens then? Because any minor disruption, you've already invested a lot in this, and then if there's not a market there, what do you do? Because and there can be a lot of backlash as well, given this kind of considerations. These are some of the considerations that we need to think about. And of course, the care burden. While we see a lot of women taking that time out, going out to work, we do see there's a intergenerational burden, and that, because I mean, even a lot of organizations keep thinking, oh, there are mothers-in-law and mothers or elder sisters taking care of the child while this woman is out for a couple of hours. But I think we need to go beyond that, because we do not want this intergenerational burden of care to be shifted from the woman to the other. And I think care investments, again, are very, very crucial. And the state's role is critical for women in NTL, from providing basic services, clean drinking water, safe roads, care investments, to even changing legislation and rules which were modeled on the characteristics of a male worker. So Amrita's group, in fact, was recently on 8th March, they have pushed the Delhi government to reconsider women of a particular height and weight to become part of the bus and the public bus transport system in Delhi. Providing loans, I think that's important, and in the women's names, to be able to start or to buy a car, to become self-sufficient. So yeah, these are just some of the context setting and criminal findings. Yeah, and these were just some of the experiences. It's always very proud. During the flood, we made a house with bamboo for a person who lost house. So these are these proud moments. Trainings, this was very interesting. One of the trainers shared that, girls are so scared of touching even the mouse of a computer, and boys are just reckless. They'll just come and start working on the keyboards, even if they don't know anything. So they actually took a lot of time, and they always would apologize, even if there was a minor, problem, which was actually not a problem, and it was completely okay. But girls were always apologetic. So there's a lot of this sort of trainers that they work around, like, it takes them almost, it's like it took me a week for them to even just get okay with the fact that they can hold a mouse and move it around. So that was something that was very interesting. And this last bit was this, she was a cab driving trainee, a 4-wheeler trainee. And she's a transgender person. and she would say, and that's where that identity is such an important thing, is when she would say that I would try and wave down vehicles and they would leer at me or would not stop. And I would be like, I'm going to drive across in a four-wheeler very soon and show you all. So that desire, that identity is such an important part of women going into NTL skilling. So yes, thank you so much. Over to you, Amrita.
Thank you so much, Anvesha. You've touched upon a number of things. I mean, I wouldn't want to summarize it, and it's very rich. But mainly what you've said is that while structural norms are being challenged, while agency is being built, while role models are being created, is the market ready to accept women in NTL? And where are we pushing the needle to help the market, the state, to become more gender sensitive, to create more gender sensitive infrastructure? Are we looking at collective spaces? Are civil society as collectives? And in fact, I'm also talking about collectives like ours. How is the collective like the NTL network in a position to push the market, to push the needle? So on that thought, going on to Nikita and learning from Quest's work with young girls. Nikita also comes from a network partner. Quest Alliance is our partner. And they've been working with women in young girls in STEM, in the ITI ecosystem, and closely with the government. So she will have her thoughts to share. And what about skill to work transition, Nikita? So what are we doing and where do we need to push the needle more? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amrita. I'm also super thrilled to be part of this really eclectic women panel. And also, I think, thanks to all the panelists and all that have been spoken about, and especially Anvesha, I think a lot of stuff that you spoke about is what we really live every day on the ground. So very relatable. And I think what I'm going to speak about probably will also, reinforce a lot of what you said as well, from really the ground up thought process. So yeah, a little bit about what we do as Quest. We are a not-for-profit, about 15 years old. Our vision really is, and we believe that individuals would thrive if they are given an opportunity to build their own learning pathways and place themselves at the center of their own career learning journeys. So that's what we really want to do in our work with young women and young adults. Our whole role is that how do we work with existing learning ecosystems like government schools in India or other skilling organizations. So it's not like, create another parallel system, but really drive this vision through key pillars of partnerships, through capacity building, by integrated some amount of technology into technology-based learning and research and advocacy being the other pillar. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, how we work with women and it's really about so I'm going to talk about two of our programs around this. So we have a program called STEM for Girls, which largely works with secondary schools, government ecosystem. The idea is that if we were to empower girls to really transition into the world of work and be ready for future careers, we need to really start early, right? So if girls are left out of future-facing career education to begin with, there is no way they're going to transcend into careers like these in future. And we really want to start early and work with at the point at which these choices are being made by students, by how are those choices being influenced by parents, by trainers, and by teachers in school. How are we creating more opportunities for women to think about STEM and why is it a future-facing pathway and career opportunity for them is something we want to speak about. So this is what we do across about 1,000 government schools in the country. We impact about 150,000 young girls studying in some of these government schools. And India, especially when we talk about government schooling ecosystem, it largely caters to poor and middle income households. So that's also something I want to draw the attention of the audience to as a fact. And the other flagship program that we work on, which is our youth development program called the MyQuest, where we work extensively with the skilling ecosystem and again the government skilling ecosystem. So we have these institutions called industrial training institutions in India, which are largely expected to train, young people on manufacturing kind of careers. So how do you sort of train to become a plumber or like an auto mechanic? So a lot of this kind of stuff. So while there are a lot of, specific women ITIs as well in the country, but again, the stark reinforcement of the fact that these trades are more women focused. And again, when you look at women ITI trades, they'll be specifically speaking about like embroidery or soft toy making. And we're like, but why don't we also open a lot more of these opportunities for young girls to learn some of these so-called non-traditional trades, right? And if you look at the co-ed ITIs, where a lot of these trades are actually being rolled out, you see very, very few percentage of women actually enrolling. So again, a lot of the factors that everyone spoke about in the panel really play out, which prevents a lot of these girls. But I guess our quest continues to sort of change some of these mindsets. And with ITIs, it really starts with saying that how do we even increase enrollments for some of these trades for women, right? And then it starts there, and then it goes all the way to working with family, working with employers, working with, every different potential constraint that might come along. So I think how we really build out our programming is from these experiences that we see ground up every day, that sort of really, prevent the school to work transition happening for girls. And also, we also do a lot of research from time to time to really see that what is happening and how do we sort of look at some of the recommendations. So what I'll talk about for the next 3-4 minutes is really, some of the research work we've been doing and also some of our experiences from the ground on what are the potential barriers that we are seeing, that prevent the transition of young girls from really school to work. So basically, even the first question, right? Like, why should we be looking at women in STEM or other non-traditional careers, right? If you look at the focus of STEM education, it is really about preparing young people for future of work, right? Like we are talking about technology being a very integral part of any career. Forget the technology-based careers only, right? Like with COVID, even like it's not just COVID. COVID, of course, has fast-tracked a lot of the integration of technology into the world of work. But today, even a security guard who sort of mans your apartment needs a mobile phone to operate the app that, when a visitor comes in, right? So that is the level of technology that is getting into the world of work. And if we don't equip our young people to deal with that, then how do we really prepare them for this future, right? So the idea is that we need this preparation to happen. The other idea is also that it's also about building a certain kind of a problem-solving mindset, right, for young people. So STEM is also about building that mindset that how you can really solve for problems and create solutions, for global problems. And there are just more and more newer problems where there's a big conversation around climate change. So how can one talk about building green solutions, and how can women be part of that same story that all of us are talking about, right? So again, starting early really helps. And some of the barriers, that we've kind of seen, and some of it has again been spoken by some of the panels. I mean, I'll speak about the barriers at 3 levels, right? Starting with these barriers at individual levels, we all know that especially in a country like India and many other South Asian countries, parents don't see value in educating girls. There are certain traditional roles, home care work that's associated with women. So that unfortunately still continues to be a reality. And when women continuously from the childhood, like, and I can say this even about myself, right? Even though I grew up in a fairly, well-endowed middle-class family, I don't think neither me or my mother was part of decision-making in the household. And that's what I grew up to believe for a very long time. That's just how it is. And we all just have to do things a certain way. But then I realized that no, this is not like how it needs to happen, right? So then things changed for me, but it's unfortunate that it doesn't change for a lot of women. They continue to remain underconfident. They continue to believe that, they cannot make decisions for the household. And their self-confidence really gets eroded when that's what gets continuously reinforced for them. Especially around puberty time, we see a lot of girls drop out from school, especially secondary schools, because that is the most difficult time for people to continue with education and carry this out. And there are several factors, that lead to that further, like the fact that women are expected to look after younger siblings. They're supposed to like get into work if household needs it. So again, their education is not necessarily the primary thing for most people. If there are limited resources in the family, the boys will always get priority over girls. In COVID, if there was remote education or virtual learning happened, women weren't the first set of people who got access, right? And even world over, and especially in countries like India, even like 22% less women have access to digital devices, and even the ones who have, they don't have access to data and internet, right? So these are the kind of factors that play out, and it pans across like the idea of for these households, affordability is an issue. Then they're concerned about safety of these women. Oftentimes women don't have skills to operate devices, and if some of these barriers they are able to transcend, then parents don't approve of them having a mobile phone, right? So it gets really, really tough to navigate through these barriers. And then I think a lot of the panelists spoke about the fact that how during COVID the whole safety and mental health became a big issue when domestic violence cases increased. So women not being able to go to school, and then having not having a safe space where they can connect with other women, I think led to a lot of mental health issues as well. So these are a whole range of individual barriers, right? If I speak about school level barriers in India, especially even how the schools are distributed, while there is a very good distribution of primary schools across the country and in the remotest of locations, but when it comes to secondary schools, they are quite not well distributed, especially in rural areas, right? So then if women have to travel to a certain distance to get to school, then the family believes that it's just better that they don't go, because then they're concerned about safety. And, so even if, as young girls, we push ourselves that, okay, no, I want to go to school, but then parents have all of these other concerns as well. So how do we make this infra a little bit better, right? If you look at the pedagogical practices that are used in school sometimes, right? If you look at some of the math textbooks, for example, from younger grades, you'd see that the illustrations, the kind of examples that are used, just so underrepresent women, right? That the data says that only 6% of mathematics books had female characters being spoken about. So that is where, the whole bias even begins, right? So when you can't even relate to some of these things, how do you even think that you can do stuff like this? So, and even on the basic pedagogical practices also, there is constant reinforcement of a lot of gender stereotypes by trainers, teachers, alongside the family. So that's the other set of things which sort of plays out as barriers at the school level. If you look at other social variables, workplaces are so gendered, right? If you look right from the hiring and promotion bias that exists, there are lack of women-friendly policies at workplaces. Largely the work culture is very, very male dominant. In most places, there is no work-life balance. So if women have to sort of balance between care work, have to balance between childbirthing and other responsibilities, how do they do it if all of these things are not sort of thought about, right? And I think a lot of us spoke about this fact that there is while I think there are one-off stories all of us spoke about, but there is largely a big lack of women role models that we can all relate to and sort of aspire to become and especially the relatable ones, right? So I think that's the other thing that sort of really prevents young women especially to have that confidence. So yeah, so I think all of these barriers from individual to school to social, at a social level, play a lot of role in preventing girls transition from school to work. So I think a lot of the work, and I'll talk a little bit about maybe a little later in the panel, how we are working around some of these barriers to the work we do in our programs. But I think some of us also spoke about the fact that there is so much of intersectionality between all of these factors. They're not sort of factors in isolation. So even when we're building solutions, how are we looking at the impact of one over the other? So I think that interconnectedness, that intersectionality is, I think, very, very important for us to keep in mind when we're designing solutions. So yeah, I'll stop at that, Amrita, and hand it over back to you.
Thank you, Nikita, for bringing the needle back to intersectionalities, the fact that we are not talking about a homogeneous group. We're talking about girls from across caste, class, religious groups, and other intersections of, divisions that are there. And of course, the fact that there is need to talk about beyond skills, beyond just skills. So negotiation, building confidence, which also Anvesha had said that, NTL has the potential to do. But the challenges are huge. The challenges in terms of implementation of, especially the challenges that they face in terms of their socialization. Thinking out of the box is difficult for young girls, but starting young, I think, is one of the answers that we have to that. And even, in terms of what you were saying and other panelists were talking about, the creation of, there is need to create that kind of an ecosystem that supports these young women. And at the network, in consultation with, there's some bit of it is Azad's work, some bit of it is the network's work. We have come up with a small framework that I'm going to talk about over here and take it to the next section. A framework which talks about the creation of a gender-just ecosystem that supports young women's work, or create spaces so that young women can access skill training, access decent jobs. We call it the gender-just skill education framework, and it says that when we need to begin with rights to access this framework. So rights to access this framework would be about norms. How are we challenging, helping young women challenge these norms, helping young women challenge mobility issues and overcome these unpaid care norms. Monica, these would you please remove the slide? Thank you so much. Yeah. Social norms, so that they can access skill training. When they are within the skill training, what is the pedagogy which we are using? Like you said, 6% of the maths books are actually having female characters. So what is the kind of pedagogy we need to use? Is it just skills? Is it short-term skills? Is it skills plus rights-based skills, transformative skills, 21st century skills? So that is very essential. And how long, how much support is required to the women? When we talk about rights through GJC, it talks about skills to work transition. So creating markets, which we saw, unfortunately, a lot of work needs to be done. And as Tracyama has also been pointing out from the chat, I saw that, there is need to push the government, there is need to push the state to create these systems which are, they're very homogenized right now. We need to understand that women have different needs, and across different intersectionalities, women will have different needs, and other gender might have different needs as well. The last would be rights from this GJC. How would you get those rights from? And that would be when markets sustain these women, or sustain, that is gender sensitive infrastructure that is created, policies that are created. So before I move on to taking the next round from our panelists, I would have a small intervention for the people who have joined us, our participants who've joined us. A small intervention in the form of what we will do as an exercise. We will have, Monica, can you please put up the Mentimeter slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So these are some of the things, some of the, pictures from women in non-traditional livelihoods that we were wanting to show you. Could you move the slide a little bit? Next slide, please. Yeah. And we wanted to ask all of you, what kind of non-traditional livelihood professions have you seen women in your country or area participating? There is a link that is going to be shared in the chat, and there is also, which has just been shared. You can click on this link and vote here. And for people who want to work on the mobile, and there is a QR code that you can scan and also go to the link. Anybody who has a problem filling in from the link can just share it on the chat, and one of our team members will pick it up and put it on the link. Has everybody been able to access the link? Any issues, please put it in the chat. We will help you out. Paridhi, can we see the screen
Yes.
share?
Monica, can you remove your screen for a second?
Okay, great. So I think a lot of people have seen cab drivers. That is coming up as the biggest one on this. Sure, someone is saying, can we go into police, military services, hospitality and driving? Yes, you can put that, anything. Yes, anything that you've seen. New areas like sound engineering, fishing in the sea, high-end finance jobs. Someone's put in food delivery. Paridhi, will you put it on the link, please? Awesome. So thank you very much for participating in this process. So we see a number of areas where non-traditional livelihoods are areas which have opened up spaces for women. Cab drivers, we can see, is the biggest right now, but yes, lots of others that have opened up. Thank you so much for this participation. Now going on to back to my esteemed panelists. Let's talk about where are we moving the needle? We have seen that there is need to create that kind of space within the state, within the market, so that women are getting that opportunity to enter and sustain. So what do you think, Sukti, would be is ILO's vision on expanding economic opportunities for women in decent work? What do you think needs to be done?
Thank you. And also thanks to the other panelists, fascinating presentations on the NTL work that's happening on the ground. I just wanted to raise, related to the presentations that were made. In fact, Aneshwar, there's a lot of work that the ILO is doing on platform economy, on gig economy. And the question, of course, is how do you bring in gender? And I think that was a very interesting aspect that you spoke about. But overall, in the context of the platform economy, I think middle-income countries are really pushing for increasing the space for platform economy workers because there's such a youth unemployment, and they see often this as offering an option. Also because the world of work is changing and digitalization is becoming, I think, as Nikita was saying, it pervades all aspects of work and life at the moment. But the big questions there that one is, how do you scale up this kind of initiatives, very interesting initiatives, but how do you scale up? Because at the end of the day, we are talking about very large numbers, especially in countries in Asia. And secondly, when you're scaling up, when you're looking at decent work, because at the end of the day, Amrita, the ILO's mandate is about promoting decent work, and decent work is productive work, which is fair income, but also done in conditions of security, safety, and dignity. And in that context, I think the platform economy poses two challenges, or the gig economy. Larger, I mean, these are not at the individual level, I'm talking about the macro level. One is that how are these workers positioned? I mean, they are not really entrepreneurs in some senses, but they are looked upon as self-employed. And therefore, they don't have the rights that go with self-employment, that go with normal wage or salaried work. So sometimes they are at the crux of the two, and they don't belong in either place. So there's a lot of court case and jurisdictions that is going around this in other countries as well, which would be important for the work that you are doing. But secondly, also for individual workers, Even though it might be a skill and it is very important, but at the end of the day, how do you ensure that it also leads to career development? Because sometimes they are not able to put this down as experiences in their CVs, etc. I'm talking about young women who might have done secondary school education. So these are some few issues which require really a whole of government approach, and I think that's what you were saying. So the advocacy is around the skilling, and I think very interesting initiatives are happening, but you need to make sure that the other angle, that the skilling comes with a job that has the necessary rights and benefits. But for the job itself, there's a lot of advocacy that needs to be done in terms of gender responsive policies or jobs for women, because it's still looked upon as a soft policy. When you talk about economic policy, at the broader level, it's still very gender blind. And I think a huge amount of advocacy is needed from all of us to ensure that the macroeconomic policies, the policies of finance, the industrial policies, which are at the end of the day determining the labor market structure and the job structure in the country, are gender sensitized. And I wanted to give one example of work that we are doing with UN Women. In a number of countries, Nepal is actually one of them, where we are working with the ministries of finance, planning, of course, labor ministries, industry, gender, but building the capacity of the government in terms of genderizing the policies for job creation. And here the focus is very much on job creation. So it's also looking at skills and the ability of a certain sector to create jobs. And finally, just again, honing back to the three sectors I mentioned, because a lot of our research shows that these are the sectors which are the sectors of the economies of the future. So the digital, of course, huge possibilities there, but of course the skills need to be there as well. But also the green, because especially in the context of this crisis, a lot of countries in their build back policies, they are assuming or taking into account a more green recovery. Again, a main question of skills. For example, the circular economy could create about 78 million jobs, but of which half could go to women, according to our estimations. There'll be a huge skill need over there. Again, non-traditional skills, some of them. And finally, not so non-traditional, but the care sector. It is kind of exploding, especially with the current crisis. But again, the question there would be, how do you ensure that women get into the non-traditional part of the care sector, a better paid part of the care sector, and don't remain at the lowest levels? So a huge amount of advocacy, I think, is still required to also to showcase these initiatives at a broader level so that they are scaled up. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukti. I completely agree with the fact that, gender responsive policies are the way to go. And in fact, the idea of care economy, if we can create that kind of a care economy, which is more remunerative, and have women not just at front lines, but across the sector, where they are in managerial positions in the care economy. So that should be the norm that we should be pushing towards. Taking on this conversation to Karuna. Karuna, you have decades of work with funding organizations, with donors, and contributing to creating spaces. How are these spaces being created for inclusion of women in skills and skills to work? How are these spaces, and what needs to be done basically to advance that norm towards gender equality? How can we collaborate and create a multi-sectoral space? Over to you, Karuna.
Thank you, Amrita. Thank you for your loaded question. I think, there have been non-traditional livelihood opportunities created for women in Nepal and worldwide. But in the context of Nepal, the scale is extremely, extremely small. And it has also been noticed that women are seen as subordinates in a non-traditional sector. For example, we have a huge migration issue in Nepal. Like daily, about 1,500 to 2,000 people migrate for work to Middle East countries and others. And women who are left behind receive remittance, and that's how their livelihoods is sustained. So there are opportunities for women to claim the space that earlier was occupied by their male family members. So unknowingly that opportunity has been created. And women, for example, have been expanding to the areas where they were not working before. For example, using solar powered irrigation pumps, which in the absence of their male family members, they are able to use this effectively. There are government subsidies on solar irrigation pumps, which is a great thing to do. But what the research shows is that these are very, very few in number, very limited in number, and it will this kind of effort may not be able to shift the gendered norms or shift women from one particular sector to a non-traditional sector. We also have, for example, one project that we are funding through jointly USAID and British Embassy are funding a human trafficking project. What the trafficking survivors are being done is trained on shoemaking, how to make shoes. So the shoemaking factories are employing these survivors of trafficking. They are working there, and they have many of them who are trained in shoemaking continue to work there. But again, the scale is extremely small. So it's not going to shift the complete picture of women getting into more and more getting into non-traditional work, but opportunities are there. Women also, for example, we are funding skills for employment program. What it does is it works with private sector organizations that create systems and help in building capacities of the women such that they enter into the non-traditional work. So in gist, there are opportunities for women caused because of COVID, caused because of migration, caused because of the sheer necessity of moving into new professions. It's there. But again, whether it has been prioritized, whether NTL has been prioritized by the government and by the women themselves remains a critical question. In Nepal, electricity is going to be a huge area of investment, electricity. So if women come into electricity work, there's going to be a lot of market. But the number of women are very few in this particular sector. So this sector, for example, has still not been prioritized. The knowledge and mindset, the deep-rooted patriarchal mindset and beliefs, and which Nikita also mentioned earlier, is women's agency herself is not as strong as it ought to be. And a few women who have broken the biases, they are criticized and questioned so much that in many instances, instead of being, rewarding or motivational for others, it becomes demotivational for women. But there are, like, for example, recently while celebrating the International Women's Day, I met a woman bouncer who works in a night bar, and she works as a bouncer, which means she physically engages in creating discipline in a bar. And what she says is her duty hours are from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. And her family members know that she is bringing money home. She's supporting with that money, her family, rent, everything. Every day she goes, the question is that, what kind of job is this 7 p.m. to 5 a.m.? As if she's not into a good job. So not all women have that kind of courage to bear the societal stigma and live through the stereotypes strongly. Structural gaps are also huge, and we don't have enough evidence, to look at, to say, this is where the market is, and this is where we should train women. Skills program are very happy training women and very happy in providing them 6 months job, and then they go away. So they're not worried about what happens in 7 months. And unfortunately, donors like us, we also feel happy if at least she's employed for 6 months, and then hoping that maybe she will continue in some other platform. So the suggestions, the last thing is that the sectoral silos that are in the country, like Ministry of Women and Children, will not talk with the Ministry of Urban. The Ministry of Urban Development will not speak with the Ministry of Law. So, though there are interministerial platforms in place, but it is not active, it is not geared towards looking at the future. So a couple of suggestions that I have for future is that, we need to look towards the future. we cannot, we all know that gender is a socially constructed thing. And in my life, what my mother went through, what I'm going through, and what my daughter is going through are completely different. I saw a phone when I saw a TV and phone when I was 30 years of age. But now a kid of 2 years now plays with the mobile. So, in my generation itself, I've seen with my own eyes how these dramatic changes have happened. And I think we have to look through the future. It cannot be an automatic thing or by chance thing that happens in our life. And throughout the value chain discussion, market discussion, we have to engage women right from the beginning. One thing, it cannot be an afterthought that, oh my God, why women are not here. It should be right from the beginning. The other thing is that, the donors, for example, could earmark funds. Donors, for example, say that, oh, we are about gender equality and others, but there's no earmarked fund. So nobody can hold them accountable to what you said and what you're doing. So earmarking funds, gender and social inclusion analysis should be made mandatory. And this will allow to see is what is that women want to do. And that has to be linked strongly with what the market has to offer. And then linked with holding their hands for a little longer time, then be happy with the 6 months job placement that the private sector offers. So we have to push ourselves a bit more. What this also means is we have to invest more funding in strengthening women's agency. We also need to look at what is being taught in schools. We are very happy seeing the data of 10 years ago saying, oh, now 100% girls are in school. But what are we teaching? We are still teaching is mother is cooking and the father is bringing money home. What a shame. That's not true anymore. Things are changing, things have changed. So we have to look at educational policies also extremely critically. We also need to, very important is to understand that, the power of collective, how collective, and this collective means women's collective and also collective of those who support women, thereby resulting in support of men and families as well. So that's extremely important. Working with women alone is extremely not important. We cannot work with group who are population at risk, who don't get opportunities. It's not enough. They are not getting opportunities because of XYZ reasons: social structure, social construct, community beliefs, our religious beliefs, our space. Mothers are worried to not send their daughters to work for 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. job because they're worried at night what is going to happen with my child. That's a genuine worry. But how are we going to engage the whole family? How do we create a space where sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment does not become a huge problem? And also, these problems are going to be there always. How do we create systems and mechanisms such that if these issues occur, how is it addressed to the satisfaction of the person who's being harassed and also to his or her family members? At the end, what I would like to say through gender equality, what we want to do is we want to transform the society. And today we see only 2 women as driving cabs, maybe 100 women driving taxis all over Nepal. But if we see thousands of women taxis in Nepal, it will become a norm. Right now, the norm is that men drive taxi. But if we see hundreds of them, thousands of them, it will become a norm. So, the transformation, I think, is to shift this norm slowly. How do we shift this norm is very important. And, we should not be very patient, and we should not say that we can take as much time as we want to bring this change. We should not say that, but at the same time, we should be patient to look at what changes has happened so far. How did that happen? And how we can amplify that to bring transformative change in the society, contributing to bringing women into NTL, but more than that. I would like to end by saying that if we look at gender inequality in isolation, we will never achieve that. In our societies, in Nepal, India, I'm sure, it's a very feudal society. And there's various different forms of inequality exist in our countries. So while we talk about addressing gender inequality, we also need to look at other forms of inequality that facilitates gender inequality as well. I'll end here. I'll be happy to answer questions if any. Thank you.
Thank you, Karuna. Moving on to taking on from you the idea that even Sukti was talking about, that scale requires interventions that need to be more than, having one person or two people. So scale requires intergovernmental intervention and multi-sectoral intervention. So going on to Nikita, what do you think you're working with the government? So what do you think are your recommendations emerging from that work with the government? Because we are talking about government and interacting with the government here to engage in scale, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of us spoke about the fact that if we want to bring in change, and given that there are a lot of actors who are involved to bring this change, and the fact that if you want to bring this change at large scale, we have to work with government systems very closely, right? Because one, they reached the most unreached, and the fact that they are everywhere, right? So I think like really strengthening existing systems hence becomes really important, right? And I think it's not easy. Like a lot of people are also mentioning in the chats, right? Like if you just talk about the area of skilling, there are just so many departments that offer skilling, right? And there is absolutely like no coherence around like what one is doing and whether the other one knows, or they're doing similar things, but there's just no sort of exchange. So it's tough to work with the government. One has to be extremely patient. But I also feel that especially in India, that's been an open, like that's been a positive upward trend where governments have increasingly becoming more and more open to inviting practitioners, not-for-profits who have, approaches that they've tried, tested on the ground, experimented with, have evidence that these work. So they are willing to, make their schools, their learning spaces, ITIs, etc., far more open. And I think 7-8 years back, I remember at Quest having these conversations that, while we keep doing these experiments on our own in different spaces, one ITI, one school, 15 schools, when are we going to get to work with the government to do this, right? And I think today our reality is that we work with Ministry of Skills Development and Entrepreneurship. We are a part of their committee on creating curriculum, which is, slightly more gender neutral. It takes a lot of, I think it takes a lot of effort to work at multiple levels to fight these mindsets, of our own teams, of officials and all of it, right? But I think there is a lot of shift. We are working with about 6-7 state government departments as well to, bring in a lot of interesting change. How do we push these departments to hold like consultations with parents on letting women come to ITIs or allowing women to work in non-traditional spaces like plumbing or mechanics and stuff like that, right? So if and especially I feel like when government pushes a certain agenda, the uptake of it is far more reaching, right? You and I can keep speaking about these on panels, but when it comes from the government and they actually seriously take these up as driving agendas, I think Karuna was saying, right, that these become the norm and they don't remain non-traditional anymore. They become like the norm as well, right? So from that point of view, I think working with government becomes really, really critical. And I think also there is a lot of investment the private sector is doing, especially in India with the CSR law coming in, right? Like each of the corporates is putting aside fair bit of money towards corporate social responsibility. So how do we, so we've also sort of formed a network called the Future Right Skills Network, for example, where we bring in a lot of people who are interested in working on a common agenda, let's say gender. How do we pool resources, pool funding to common, goals, and then bring in government to, align to some of those goals. So when you look at these kind of multi-stakeholder partnerships in some sense, I think those have a far-reaching impact. I feel otherwise we tend to do a lot of experiments in isolation. We can feel very happy about bringing a certain change, talk about certain stories of change. But I think, like we were saying, if we were to look at some of these things at large scale, we really, really need to nail some of these partnerships. And I think advocacy, I can't speak enough about how important it is to continue to keep doing research, continue to putting this out, continue to bring out these stories, right? In the forefront. I almost keep telling my team as well, right? Like we should start running some campaigns with industries which actually employ women in non-traditional livelihoods, right? And L&T, which is a construction company, they increasingly, for example, have a lot of focus on now hiring women construction workers, right? Can they become like a champion employer to really drive the the cause of women in non-traditional livelihoods and how other industries can do a lot more of this, create certain gender neutral or gender supportive practices, right? So I think it would require a fair bit of work at different spaces and advocating and completely staying at it. And I think nowadays when you see certain advertisements as well that reinforce the fact that we need to break gender stereotypes, right? I think those things have a far-reaching impact on the masses as well. So I think a lot of these efforts is what I think we all kind of need to continue. And I think just last thing I wanted to say is that two stages, that we have seen, we really need to do focus programming at in order to sort of ensure the school to work transition. One, at the time of puberty, a lot of women, we lose from the school system itself, right? So how can we look at focus programming with government, with other stakeholders at this stage, right? Which is really the defining stage of a women's education when they're transitioning from primary to secondary or secondary to senior secondary, right? And the other is that the women who have managed to get through to primary, secondary to higher ed, and even in the world of work, sometimes a lot of them again sort of get lost at the time of marriage and childbirthing, right? So how can we look at focus programming at this stage so that we don't lose wherever few women have managed to be here? So a couple of these stages, if we focus as areas, from a women and a gender lens, I think it could go a long way in the way we work. So yeah, I'll stop here, Amrita, and back to you.
Thank you. I love the bit about advocacy with the, creating champions, like you said, the case of L&T. So that is something that I think, of course, multi-sectoral is very important, but creating champions who can speak for themselves. I mean, they themselves become their own, they create that industry norm then. Because changing, challenging norms, we can use the existing tools within the industry to challenge the norms. Perfect. So let's go on to Anvesha, and then we will open the floor for us, some of our questions that are there. Anvesha, over to you. Yes. Some of the key pathways that you think are emerging from the studies, some of the key things that you would want to leave as recommendations, adding on to what the panelists have also already said.
Yes, I think as we've already been speaking about a lot of the scaling up advocacy, I think some of the question is also on how networks can come together. Nikita has very clearly pointed out on multi-stakeholder partnership, and I think this is something it's very important. And I think that one of the strengths in the study that came up is the fact that there is a network and there is a virtual give and take that keeps happening between partners of this network. I think that's a very important point. You sort of not just take help from each other, but also then look at it in terms of how do you scale up, how do you reach out at an advocacy level. From the study, very, very, just to begin with, of course, there's a big need for the market to be ready. I think that is one of the focus areas. A lot of women are getting skilled, and we hope that this will be scaled up. That is something that is very important. A lot of investment around care investment is another thing, not just care, but even simple things like clean drinking water, safety on roads. I think these are important infrastructure for any woman to actually go out there and work to begin with. Working within families and communities, I think that is another very important point. It's an ongoing process, and I think that just needs to be strengthened all throughout. And of course, working with the state, that just goes without saying that is a very important point. Somebody from the participants has pointed out at looking at sexual harassment at the workplace. I think that is a very important point. While skilling, and as well as looking at sexual harassment at the workplace when women go out to work, during the process of going to work and at the workplace. I think the very idea that now the workplace is also being redefined to include your commuting, etc. Your home can also be your workplace. So there are various angles to look at sexual harassment at the workplace, and it's important to take this up. It's an invisible force that just doesn't go away, and I think a lot of advocacy also needs to be done in lieu with NTL skilling as well. Yes, I won't take much time because we just have 15 more minutes. So if there are comments, questions, I think let's take that, Amrita. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Anvesha, and very good point on gender sensitive infrastructure. Yes, from hygienic toilets to workspace sexual harassment policies, all of that is very critical for sustaining, long-term sustaining. All of that would be very essential. So Monica, can you read us the questions? Are there any questions from the chat? I can see 2 in the quick Q&A. If there are any other questions, or let me read out the Q&A questions first. So Sushmita is talking about how can civil societies work together and strategize to advocate on NTL with policymakers and governments. Anybody who wants to talk about that? Anybody can take it. Anybody who wants to talk about how can civil societies work together and strategize to advocate on NTL with policymakers and governments? Nikita, any thoughts from what you've already been working on?
Yeah, I could do that. I think
yeah.
That's a really good question, and that's something we are also trying to do as Quest. I think one of our core pillars has been partnerships and driving through that. I think civil societies, and I think historically civil societies also have been very territorial, right? Like I think it sort of comes from the fact that everybody's sort of fighting for a similar funding space. But I think this also has matured a lot, right? So I feel like civil society, and this is again something we are trying to do a lot of extensive work around. So we do have a partner network of about 70 odd organizations that we work with. And I think there needs to be some common narrative that, sort of how do we all see value in doing something common? The fact that, again, going back to the thing that when you do things collectively, the impact of it is so much more far reaching. When you collaborate, I think the fact that you could just use the resources so much more optimally instead of us as Quest having to open office in every location. If you want to work in a certain location, is there an existing partner who has similar, vision, mission, approach? Could we exchange that and exchange knowledge? So I think it takes a lot of effort, right? Collaboration does not come very naturally. So I think being able to invest in the idea of collaboration, being able to invest into a common vision, being able to not drive it from the lens of your organization and my vision, but a larger vision that we all align to, and this sort of having its identity of its own, the network that, you could potentially form together. I think those have been some of our learnings as well. So that's kind of one. When the other is, I think increasingly, I feel, with the kind of the amendments that have happened in laws, I think there could be some of these stronger organizations who could take, a lead role as like almost like a parent organization to support smaller organizations in the region through like vision, mission, resources, capacity building support, funding. Those are the other areas, in which civil societies could actually come together and work. Because I feel like the impact we can make together is so much more than what we can do individually. So that's kind of been our experiences of doing this. And then I think just regularly exchanging knowledge, meeting beyond everyday conversations to talk about larger issues and what we can all do together, I think really, really helps. So that have been some of our experiences.
Thank you. Just adding on from the network here, actually, we have similar experiences with you, a common narrative, common advocacy agendas, and working together. But we've also embarked on a new process of, actually training practitioners to become advocates. So, and I think, although it's a pilot project that the network has started, but training the people who are actually working on the ground to become advocates within their states is a huge push that can be done. And if as collaborating organizations, we can come together and do that in our spaces, in our different spaces, we can create strong voices from the ground, advocating for their own rights. And that, I think, would be a very powerful narrative to create. Next question, or anybody wants to answer to this question, then I will just read out the next question also. How can the uneven push forward, how can the UN push forward the idea of NTL to all countries and give it some priority? Karuna or Sukti, anybody from that space who can give us that kind of a...
Okay, I can come in very quickly. So the ILO as a UN agency, as you know, works with governments, but also employers organizations and workers organizations. And we do have big projects in several countries where it's for STEM for girls, vocational training in the non-traditional crafts for women, etc. But I think on the one hand, the UN's role is really to train the practitioners, as you were saying, so that it really reaches scale. But on the other hand, it's also to do the kind of research and the advocacy to the member states, using good examples, using the data to really change mindset, because it's not going to happen overnight. And it requires a multi-sectoral approach to really make change happen. But I think I'm very positive that generational shifts are happening, at least in terms of mindsets. So hopefully, things will change for the better. But with those shifts, the current world situation, the labor market is such, there are a lot of challenges. So it requires, economic policies, but it requires also legislation, strong legislation. So again, a coordinated approach to make the change. And at the end of the day, rights of women in terms of violence in the workplace, in terms of maternity benefits, in terms of non-discrimination. These are, the ILO is a standard-setting organization. So we have conventions on all of these, which member states can learn from and also implement. Thank you.
I would like to come in, Amrita, just for a second. I think, the civil society organizations have pilot tested a few of these interventions. So what UN can do is influence the governments to scale up those small interventions. Because, civil society will never have enough funds to do that at a large scale. And ILO is an exception as an organization to set standards, but other UN organizations, in my experience, have not always set examples. So I think it would be important for UN itself, UN Women in particular, to show, sort of, because they are closer to women civil society organization, they know what is happening in the ground. So they could use their influencing power to really influence the government to scale up some of the interventions. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Karuna. And we will, reach out to UN Women with that recommendation to take it forward. Now, do we have any other questions, Monica?
No.
Any other questions? One attendee has raised their hand. Could we have like 3 minutes into the session? So could we ask her to speak if she has a question or comment before we close the session?
Dimple, would you like to speak?
Dimple, would you please unmute yourself and speak? Thank you, Anvisha.
Yeah. I think we need to promote her to the panelist. Yeah, Dimple, we've unmuted you if you want to add to this.
This was a very enriching session. So one of the non-traditional occupations that I came across was conductor jobs in DTC. So this girl I spoke to, so they had a different timing, and yes, she kept to herself. She did, as Anvisha said, like the drivers keep to themselves. She also, though she was in a government job, but the pay structure again was very different over there. According to the number of hours she put in, it was not like a government job. It was more like a, depending on the number of hours. And within care work, that, so when we look at non-traditional, sectors, and, how much of employment can be generated there, as well as, willingness of many to really, become part of that. there are many challenges. So one, as we look at transformation, particularly the green jobs, you will see a concentration of women in the low end part, in the garbage collection, where I feel, or many times I have felt, again it is the women getting concentrated in the low paid and the work that is having less value, and the work that nobody else will do for the pay, in a way. Whereas the higher end part of the green jobs, where you are in training to the higher end development design of let's say solar equipments, I mean, there again, there's a lot of barriers. And I think the work that people like Quest are doing is really great, in the sense that, you are trying to address, class 8 onwards, when you are going to make that transition. I mean, that is where we have to find the change, maybe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dimple.
Thank you. Thank you, Dimple. And on that hopeful note of creating more role models, creating more camaraderie within non-traditional livelihood, creating more agents of change, more strong voices, and a multi-sectoral approach towards a change where we work with the government, where we work with the civil society, and where we work with the industry to create markets that accept women, sustain women, and also create those policies and spaces for diverse women, not just homogenized policies, but diversity, and using evidence-based advocacy to take this forward. On that note, I would like to thank everybody, all the panelists, thank ISST, thank the NTL network members who have made this possible, made this session possible, because, had we not had a network together, we wouldn't have collaborated with ISST, wouldn't have had that space. Thank you to CSW, thank you to Janvi from ISST, who's the director, and thank you to all our practitioners who inspire us and continue to inspire, and we will continue to get inspired and advocate for them, with them. Thank you to everybody who has been part of this session. On that note, thank you. And I would like to end this session. Great to have you here. Great to have such an enriching panel here. Thank you, everybody. Karuna, Sukhi, Nikita.
Can I please request everyone to put
And
their
Andresha.
videos on just for 1 second? We would like to take a screenshot of this, whoever can possibly, including the participants. Thank you. Monica, would you please take a picture? Yep, is that good? Great. Thank you.